It's Tuesday, November 25th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, we unpack that mystery of how a St. John's soldier killed in France 108 years ago has caught the attention of historians. The remains could be those of Private George Patrick Kirk, but a family mystery is stalling the identification process. And that's right, listener, there could be a role for you in this, and you're going to hear that shortly. What we will do, I've got 4 folks lined up here for the show today, and also if at any point, if you got questions for them or just thoughts for us, give us a call, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. Or you can text us, 709-327-8206, the signal at cbc.ca. I was sitting around the newsroom last week when Terry Roberts comes over to my desk. He's like, hey, come on, take a look at something. So I go over to his desk, and I didn't know what I was going to look at. And then I see this script, right? So this news script that he'd written. He's like, what do you think about this? So I read through it. And it floored me. It's this story of the mystery around Private George Patrick Kirk. And we're going to dig into it. It was one of these ones, Terry's so good at doing these stories and putting the call out. He like on this, I don't know if you can call it a beat, but I mean, he's been so constant on these important military connection history stories for Newfoundland and Labrador. So his was this jumping off point into when I saw the script. I was like, I'm going to get in touch with folks and do this on Tuesday. So here we are. Terry, by the way, he may call in today, but he's also on assignment a little bit outside of town. So if he doesn't, it's because he's working on another story. Here with me, we've got 2 folks on the line. We've got Alexandra McKinnon, a research historian with the Department of National Defense. Hi, how you doing?
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on the program. And is Renee next to you or in a different office? Are you even, I have no idea how closely you two work together.
So we normally share an office, but we figured it would be easier to have one of us call in from home today. So.
Okay, so Renee Davis, a historian as well with D&D Casualty Identification Program. How you doing?
Good. How about you?
Good. Thanks you too for taking time, for both of you. So before we go back to, I'm going to get both of you to kind of set the stage a bit and also to talk about what the Casualty Identification Program is and what the role is or could be for folks in Newfoundland and Labrador who are listening to this today. Here with me in the studio, Frank Gogos is here, military historian, author, and also chair of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment Museum. Welcome back. How you doing?
Hey, Adam.
Thanks for coming in. And Sean Cadigan, Memorial University history professor, author of many a fine book, including the History of Canada series, Death on Two Fronts, National Tragedies, and the Fate of Democracy in Newfoundland, 1914 to 1934. How you doing?
Good, thanks.
All right. Let's start with the story at hand, and then what we'll do through the course of the full 55 minutes on this show is we'll start with this story, this mystery about Private George Patrick Kirk and the larger story around it. Then we will also dip into a bit around the time, the politics, the context, the life in Newfoundland and Labrador, specifically though in this case St. John's, early 20th century. And we'll talk about the unknown soldier. We will talk about the regiment. We'll talk about Newfoundlanders and Labradorians fighting with the Canadians in the First World War. So there's a lot there to kind of get to. But Alexandra, I guess we'll start with you. Where did all this start? For the start of this mystery on your end of it, under the identification process side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the Casualty Identification Program, we generally work on 2 types of cases. There's both what we refer to as remains cases, so when human remains are found, generally as a result of a construction project or road works or farming activity. And there's also what we refer to as graves cases, so when we try to identify someone who's already buried as an unknown soldier. And in this case, this is a remains case. We currently have 42 active remains cases. All of these involve human remains that have been found somewhere on the former Western Front. because of the scale of the fighting that's taking place there, fighting over the same ground again and again. While a tremendous amount of effort went into post-war battlefield clearances to bury the dead, to name the dead where possible, there's still a lot of people still in the ground from this conflict. And in this instance, the story that we're working on at the moment, this story begins in April 2016 in a town called Lens in northern France, where a clearance operation is taking place in advance of a construction project. And in this instance, while clearing the ground in preparation for building a parking lot, the remains of a Canadian soldier are found. And while this ground now is a parking lot, in August 1917, it was a German trench called Humbug Alley. It was part of the fighting of a battle called the Battle of Hill 70, which is the high ground overlooking the French town of Lens. It's part of the advance that follows the capture of Vimy Ridge in April 1917. In this instance, even though these remains are found in what was then a German trench, we know this man was Canadian, and more specifically, we know this man was likely a member of the 13th Battalion, who were the Royal Highlanders of Canada. And we know this because he's found with a few artifacts, including, most importantly for us, his collar badges that point to him being a member of the 13th Battalion. He's also found with things like some coins in his pocket. He's found with a hair comb and some nail clippers, but nothing that gives us a particular name for this man. But with this work, with the Casualty Identification Program, our research into remains cases involves a few steps. We have historical research, so looking at what units were involved in fighting in an area, what artifacts might be able to tell us, who's missing from a particular action. We have forensic anthropology, so what the remains themselves can tell us, how tall somebody might have been or how old they might have been approximately. But the third part of this process, and this is where we're at this stage, we've been able to figure out who's missing from this unit. We've been able to look approximately at how tall and how old people were, looking at who the primary candidates are. But at this point, we're looking for DNA. And we have no DNA on file from the World Wars, as you might imagine. So instead, what we need to look for are family members who meet specific criteria. So there's specific lines of descent. And if we're able to track down a living family member, and if they're willing to provide us with a DNA sample, so essentially we have to phone them up and ask for some spit, then that helps us determine whether or not there's a familial match between that family member and the remains. So that hopefully, at the end of that process, if we're able to find a match, that helps us give this person their name back.
What's it like doing, before we keep going on this, what's it like doing this work? Because like for me listening, it sounds like, don't know how anyone ever figured out all of this to be able to put this together for like these almost impossible mysteries to kind of like to unearth what you've done, and then to use DNA plus everything else you just mentioned just seems so complicated. But then to boil it all down to connecting a family with someone lost, over 100 years ago, what's it like for you?
Oh, it's tremendously meaningful work, and I have to say it's really, really satisfying when we're able to put those pieces together and able to figure out exactly who somebody is. The ultimate purpose of this work is always for the dead to be buried with their name, by their regiment, and in the presence of their family. And when we're able to make an identification, it all seems very straightforward in retrospect, going step by step, filling in the blanks. But it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, the First World War, the scale of devastation on the battlefield, the challenges of post-war battlefield clearances, there are just so many unknown factors in all of this. But on those occasions where we're able to give somebody their name back, it's really, really special.
It talks about the layers of humanity too, right? When you start with like, well, this, it's a parking lot now, and in the First World War it was a battlefield, and just to think of the juxtaposition there, and to think of what has remained hidden all these years, and just by, a bit of chance there, and where we are now of the possibility of finding the descendants of this person. I mean, that's wild.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. For anyone listening who's had the chance to go to the Western Front, it's one of the extraordinary things when you visit these places, particularly because the roads have been rebuilt along the same lines, the railways have been rebuilt along the same lines. You can overlay trench maps with where you're standing and figure out exactly what was going on there more than a century ago at this stage, and it seems far too peaceful for any of that to have happened.
Frank, you've done this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me your experience of just to complement what Alexandra's saying.
She's absolutely right. Over the years, not just myself, but the people that I bring over as well, we try to put them, in those fields and try to give them a sense of, this is where the action took place, and it doesn't matter if it's Beaumont Hamel or Manier or Goudoucourt. We're walking on ground that they fought over from the Newfoundland Regiment perspective, because this is what I concentrate on. And you're standing in an open field, a farmer's field that doesn't look like anything in particular, and when you go through the process, you explain to them what happened here. But I will say this, oftentimes if you look closely in the ground, you will find remnants of those battles in terms of explosives.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing is quite common. So when you're able to connect that with people, it certainly impacts how they process it.
What's the I mean, I'm assuming the range from when you bring people over, it goes everything from silence to crying to chitter chat in between.
It becomes very emotional.
Yeah.
Many people that we go over with really don't have a foundation, a good foundation of what to expect. But by the end of that trip, most people are moved by it. Now, when you go back to the chit-chat, we do try to lighten things up as well, because it can become overwhelming emotionally for some people.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. And it's just, it's about acknowledging and recognizing how people may feel around that. I want to bring Renee Davis into the conversation too. Renee, tell us a bit about just your history as just the work you've been doing around the casualty identification program as a historian.
So I've been working with the program for a number of years now, and we're a small but mighty team. So there's Alexandra, Dr. Sarah Lockyer, myself, Dr. Melissa Davidson, and we often have student researchers that support us as well. Small team, but we do our best. My area of expertise is actually in the identification of graves cases. So those where we don't have the skeletal assemblage to actually conduct the anthropological analysis. That means ultimately I don't have the anthropological makeup, nor do I have the ability to get a DNA sample or an isotope sample to compare. And so my research is entirely based on basically putting together those historical pieces to try and identify soldiers so that we can replace the headstone, have a rededication ceremony, and give their names back in that way. I would just like to emphasize, I suppose, the challenge of the historical research, regardless of whether it is an identification of remains or a graves case. We are having to pull records from archives across the world. And basically, I tried to describe it to the students like we're playing a game of Clue. We're trying to take these documents and figure out what happened, who was killed, how they were killed. Of all those who were killed, who's still missing, who do we need to figure out was in the ground exactly where we're looking, as opposed to maybe an aviator who crashed nearby, or prisoners of war that were being evacuated, or wounded who are moving back, because oftentimes the story is never as simple as it may seem, and that's just the complexities of war. And so sometimes you have candidates that pop up that you think, at the beginning, they shouldn't have been where they were, or vice versa. Perhaps we have a primary candidate that all the documentation was suggesting he was supposed to be elsewhere, but it just speaks to the confusion of war, and having to sift through all of that through the archival material is quite a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there's where people may have been ordered to, then the reality of where they may have ended up, and those things could be very, very different.
Quite common.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
In the fog of war. Sean Cadigan, Professor Cadigan, this conversation, it's when I started talking about, and we'll get into this, right? Private George Patrick Kirk. Talk to me about Newfoundland. I'll say Newfoundland when the province was Newfoundland, before Newfoundland and Labrador, but turn of the 20th century. What was going on here? Give us the flavor of life then.
Right. So I'd like to think about that by starting first with the fact that we have a person identified as George Patrick Kirk, who enlisted in Canadian military service, while and in his enlistment papers identified himself as somebody who was working at Stellarton as a miner, although born in St. John's in Newfoundland. And so I think about a person who has left Newfoundland for Cape Breton. in this time period. And so there are lots of things that we can say about Newfoundland. The end of the 19th century was a very difficult time economically. There had been a bank crash. There was a crisis of overextension in the fishery. Of course, the Great Fire in St. John's, lots of problems. But if you were in St. John's, there was probably more economic diversification and economic opportunity as a result of a policy of fostering both railway development and industrial protected manufacturing development in the city area. So it's hard to generalize about it being a difficult time, but I would say this. Very few people went into mining because it was a great, safe place to work. It was a very difficult form of employment. So people who tended to migrate to work in mining did so because they really needed employment. If not, they were desperate for employment. And to really be clear, many Newfoundlanders in particular, many people from the island went to Cape Breton to work in mining. By about 1914, there were roughly 6,000 people of Newfoundland origin who would have listed themselves as, for example, having been born in Newfoundland, living and working or related to somebody working in Cape Breton, and many of them in mining.
Yeah, I'm assuming the merchant class was not sending their young kids, their older kids to work in mines.
But what's interesting about this is that we think about the fishery here, and we think about exploitation by merchants, exploitative credit practices, all those sorts of things. In mining in Cape Breton, generally speaking, there was company housing, company stores, payment in scrip, something like truck, and credit manipulation, just as there was here. So it wasn't, appreciably different than what we would have thought of as a very troubled economic sector, a big sector in Newfoundland. Nevertheless, people thought it was worth going for.
Yeah, well, trying to pay the bills and go wherever you can.
Precisely.
And then, and before I go back to the folks on the phone to start filling in a bit more of this story, before I go back to Alexandra there, folks going, looking for mining, looking for work, right? What happens as the war breaks out, and how do people start answering that call?
Right. So this is another very important element of this story, is that it's a very important reminder that we in Newfoundland tend to associate the First World War in service by the sheer importance of it with the experience of the Newfoundland Regiment. But we have to remember that many, many Newfoundlanders found themselves in other parts of the world, especially in parts of Canada, such as in the case of the likely Private Kirk, as working there, and that's where they mobilized. And they mobilized eventually, as in all the far-flung parts of the British Empire where Newfoundlanders found themselves, and eventually some mobilized in the United States when it became a combatant. So there were Newfoundlanders everywhere, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians everywhere. What I find interesting about this is that when Newfoundland was thinking about how it should conduct its part of the war effort, how best to contribute, of course, many people supported the idea that Newfoundland should field its own regiment. A very important person in Newfoundland who did not support that idea was William Coker, who was, in effect, emerging as the leader of the opposition at the time, and he opposed the formation of a regiment for one simple reason. He said it's important to support the war effort, but Newfoundland cannot afford this venture. Newfoundland cannot afford a regiment. We can't afford the expense of it. More importantly, he said at the time, regiments cost not just in putting them in the battle, but in the bills that come for years afterwards, in pensions and compensation for survivors. And that will be a very difficult burden for Newfoundland to bear. So his argument was Newfoundlanders should mobilize with Canadian and British forces. Full stop. No Newfoundland regiment, because we couldn't afford it. And we would not, this is the important part, we would not be able to live up to what we would owe veterans and their families afterwards for their service.
And in your opinion, how right or wrong was he around that?
I think as I understand it, we compensated veterans at roughly half what the Canadian government paid to its veterans.
Right.
So were Newfoundland and Labrador soldiers worth half Canadian soldiers?
Great questions. We've got Terry Roberts is on the line. Terry, where are you to?
Hi, Adam. Well, I'm out on assignment here in Conception Bay North, and I thought, what better place for me to go now to talk to you than the cenotaph here in Spaniards Bay. This is the home of Matthew Brazel here. Of course, he's famous for the Newfoundland Regiment in the First World War. He was on the field of battle with Tommy Ricketts, who late in the war when his daring deeds got him the Victoria Cross. And I know Matthew Brazel was later awarded the French version of the Victoria Cross, the Croix de Guerre. So, this is where I am right now in Spaniards Bay at the First World War Memorial right here.
Well, look, we talked about the story and your work off the top of the show. I said you might have time in between the reporting you're doing today to give us a little call. How did this? I love talking to reporters about process because I think it shows a lot about the work we do and some of the meaning around it and what can happen. How did this story, this latest one about Private George Patrick Kirk and the mystery, the 108-year-old mystery, come to your attention?
Yeah, well, it came from just being out in the community, and that's every day that I'm out in the community is a good day. And I knew there was a remembrance-themed event at Memorial University in the lead up to November 11th, and Sarah Lockyer was going to be the guest speaker. And I said, I'm not going to miss that because I know that she played a big role in the repatriation of our unknown soldier last year. And her presentation was quite fascinating, talking about how they identify soldiers. And in the middle of her presentation, in her trying to encourage descendants of missing soldiers to register with the Casualty Identification Program, she just casually dropped the information that there's been 4 Royal Newfoundland Regiment soldiers, the remains, unidentified, have been found, in her words, overseas. And that floored me, of course, because it's, I said, my news nose went off, and I said, that's a story. So, and I did that story, and I'm sure that Alexandra can attest to this, that, they had a flood of registrations in the days that followed. Over 100, I think, Alexandra is the number you quoted. So, and there's 800 missing Newfoundlanders. So that's really helped build the database, and it gave me some encouragement, I guess, that, us in the media, we're still relevant. People still follow us, and that was very reassuring. And I guess Alexandra and her team, I guess they realized that, there's some power in the media, and maybe we can, and we've been sitting on these remains here now for 9 years trying to find out who this is, and we've narrowed it down quite small. The number of candidates, and so let's go back to the CBC and see if we can shake that family tree and see if we can identify this and see if our suspicions are that this could be a St. John's born soldier. And so that's where we are here today. We're certainly generating some conversation, and that's a good thing. And
since the story came out earlier this week about this 108-year-old mystery and the potential around it being Private George Patrick Kirk, what's the response been since then in the last couple of days?
Yeah, well, sometimes there are stories that we do that really strikes a chord, Adam. You know that, and this is one of them. I've been my email has been humming for the last number of days since the story appeared, and also my phone. So I've gotten calls from people who say you should call this person with the last name Quirk. There's Fortune Harbor, Buckins Junction, Buckins, St. John's. Even someone from the Isle of Man reached out to me and said that, we believe we might have a connection to the Quirk family. So, but I think the one that really caught my attention was an email I received yesterday from a genealogist in St. John's, by the way, who works for police forces across Canada and the United States. And I'm not going to give it all away, but you wouldn't believe he did some searching. Within a couple of hours, he came up with some amazing data that I believe I forwarded on to Alexandra, and I believe that there could be some really good leads in what we've received. I'll even use his name, and that's Devin Griffin. It was amazing the amount of research that he did in a short number of hours yesterday. Even found the death certificate for Private Kirk Quirk's mother, Anne, or Anastasia. So, he was able to come up with some amazing information, and I'm sure that that will be helpful to Alexandra and her team.
Amazing. Yeah, Terry, I've been watching you on the phones the last couple of days. I thought you took on a hobble as a call center operator. You've been using the phone so much. So anyways, amazing work. Thanks for taking time to pop on the show to fill out a little bit around the reporting. I appreciate it.
Right, Adam. Well, listen, I hope that within the next couple of years, there are 5 candidates, right? 4 Newfoundland soldiers have been found in overseas, and now the remains of this soldier. Wouldn't it be great if in the coming years, if Alexandra and her team can identify those 5 soldiers? I know that I and many others will be quite interested in how that unfolds.
Very much so, sir. Thank you again, and I'll see you when you get back to the shop.
Thank you.
All right, bud. Terry Roberts there. Alexandra McKinnon. I'll toss the ball back to your court to pick up on some of what Terry was saying there, and I'd love to drill back into some of the mystery and how you've been trying to figure out how it might be, the possibilities around Private Kirk / Quirk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say we've been really pleasantly overwhelmed, I think is the correct term, by the level of interest from Newfoundland. It's been absolutely brilliant. Every registration form, every person who gets in touch, it hopefully puts us one step closer towards identifying these unknown soldiers, whoever they do wind up being.
Oh, and just put the call out too. Like if folks are listening right now and if they're looking back at their family history and knowing it's like, gosh, my great grandfather, my great uncle, or something. If they think there's a connection to someone who's missing, what do they do?
So if they're related to somebody who's missing, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a close connection. So if you start thinking about your grandparents' cousins, for example, or even further, if you look up the Casualty Identification Program on our website, which is part of National Defence's website, you'll be able to see a registration form for families. So if you fill out your details there, everything that you know about this missing person that you're related to, whether they're a soldier or a sailor or an aviator, if you fill out what details you have and a bit of information about yourself, then we'll be able to save your details. And if they appear as a candidate, either in a current case or in a case in the future, then we can get in touch. And it saves me tracking you down, which always makes my life a bit easier.
I want to bring Renee back into this, Alexandra, too. So, Renee, just give me some of your thoughts, either what Terry was saying there or just your thoughts on the work of, or even some numbers around identifying folks over the years and some of these connections that have been made.
Yeah, so the program has been formally around since 2007, identifying the remains of Canadian service members and those from Newfoundland. But Canadians and Newfoundlanders have been identifying their own since the very outbreak of war. Like originally, it was units that were having to pull their own men off the battlefields and do the burials, and they were doing the best they could. But the First World War was kind of a learning process in how do you document where you're burying individuals, how do you deal with identification discs, particularly in early days where there's only one. How do you make sure that information is properly documented and then conveyed back to family or to the bureaucracy to ensure that grave is never lost? And then what happens when the battlefields are fought over in subsequent fights, subsequent battles that mean that artillery fire may destroy small cemeteries or battlefield graves? And so this was all kind of a long learning process. And unfortunately, that does mean that we do still have thousands and thousands of missing Canadians and Newfoundlanders from the First and even the Second World War. And so to Terry's point, we do get new cases every single year. There are still people being unearthed, and we have external researchers from all over the world who submit us cases about partially identified graves that they think they may be able to identify. So every year we get more and more. And I guess one of the points I always try to emphasize is the fact that at the end of the day, this is a massive communal effort to try to identify these individuals, whether it's someone who we have a skeletal assemblage to work on or whether it's a grave. We need people all over the place letting us know. And I think this response from Newfoundland has just shown us that much more how much this communal effort truly means for everyone. It's, as Alexandra said, it's a rather overwhelming response, but I think it speaks volumes to the ongoing importance of this work. It doesn't matter that these individuals were killed over 100 plus years ago. There's still these deep emotional ties. And I think despite knowing that this work takes a tremendous amount of effort and time, and often, for whatever reason, we aren't able to get the name. We do have to still to this day bury individuals as unknowns, or we are unable to actually change a headstone for a variety of reasons because these cases are so complex. Every single time that we are able to move forward and get a name, it means so much to so many people. And all these individuals, whether it's a genealogist in St. John's, or whether it's a Commonwealth War Graves Commission staff member, or whether it's, us in our little office in Ottawa, it resonates so strongly with us. And I think that really motivates us to try and keep promoting the program, talk to individuals like yourself, encourage people to register, read the biographies on our website about all the individuals we've identified thus far, watch the news when we do release the names of newly identified individuals. We do public announcements so that members of the public are welcome to go and attend the reburial ceremonies or the rededication ceremonies. So just, kind of keep your finger to the pulse, because this is ongoing history. It's a legacy that is changing to this day. And I think that there's just so much to that. And I'm honored to be a part of it. So, yeah.
Sean Cadigan, as we have this discussion, and in this case, part of it is about one individual, but we're remembering, we're trying to unearth the connections of saying, are these remains this person? At the same time, this enables us to have a conversation around this province, this community, the communities of this province, late 19th, early 20th centuries. What do you think about these types of things as these conversations come up as a historian of this place?
Right. Well, I would say first, it's important to remember that for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, the experience of the First World War was a Newfoundland and Labrador experience. It was also an imperial experience. It was a Canadian experience. It was probably for many Newfoundlanders or Labradorians, possibly even an Australian experience, for example. Newfoundlanders were far-flung around the world as they sought work and opportunities. And I think that the likely experience of Private Kirk is a reminder that although we tend to think about our history, I mean the history of this province, in terms of almost stereotypes, or back to the Gulf, come near at your peril, Canadian wolf, all that kind of thing. In fact, we had a very close relationship with Canada that long predated 1949, a tremendous exchange of peoples and culture, ideas, and so on. And part of it was Newfoundlanders and Labradorians going to parts of Canada to look for work. But we have to remember, especially on the littoral of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, that there were many people historically who crossed from places like Cape Breton to seek opportunities on the west coast of Newfoundland. And there was a lot of Canadian capital that came into Newfoundland to develop particular types of industries. A very small example. If you're listening from Hampton and White Bay South today, you're living in a community that got its start as a planned company town by a forest developer named Harry Crow from Nova Scotia. Right. So these connections are really important, and this is a very good example or an occasion on which to think about how closely interconnected that we were, both in the actual experience of this war, but in a broader way.
And here's a note from Terry's story, right? Private Kirk was, and we mentioned this, Private Kirk was killed on August 15th, 1917 on the first day of battle of Hill 70 and is one of the 27,000 Canadians and Newfoundlanders and Labradorians listed as missing from the First World War, Second World War, and Korean conflict. Frank, when with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier here in St. John's, when you hear that number of 27,000 Canadians and Newfoundlanders and Labradorians listed as missing, First World War, Second World War, Korean conflict, I'm just your thoughts on the importance of having a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
From my perspective and many others, having a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is probably the only way that we can, I'd say, commemorate or remember those that we'll never identify.
Yeah.
For whatever various reasons. So it becomes very important. And the numbers reflect that of those who, from the first, many of them from the first, second as well as Korea, the missing and how difficult it is to identify those people.
Yeah, and it's that, for me, just thinking from coverage we've done for CBCNL, talking to folks like yourselves, it's that everyone can have that family connection, even if they don't know. It's like this is for us,
Absolutely, and to those families who argue that a bigger effort should have been made to identify, I hope they can take solace in the fact that it wasn't done will give some closure to other families who will never, ever be able to identify their lost ones.
Oh, and I know you've done this, but to go to the War Memorial, the National War Memorial in St. John's, and you look at folks take a moment in front of the unknown soldier's grave there, it's quite the thing to watch.
Yeah.
I want to the wrinkle in this story, the difficult bit around Private George Patrick Kirk. Alexander, can you go into that a bit of as you searching, because there's the call to try to get DNA. So why is it a little bit more or talk to me about some of the complicating factors around figuring out whether or not this could be him.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, one of the steps in our identification process for the identification of remains is finding a viable DNA donor. And of course, in this context, as I said, it sounds very straightforward once we've made an identification, but not all war dead missing from these conflicts will have known relatives that we're able to trace. Not all relatives will be viable DNA donors. And not all relatives will want to be involved. I mean, it's a very strange thing to be asked if you're not necessarily even aware of this person who existed before the government calls you up and tells you they're a candidate in a case. And I should say Private Kirk is far from the only candidate who's been tricky to track down. For example, there's another man missing from Hill 70 who's a candidate in a number of our cases, and he gave his place of birth simply as Serbia, which is
a bit
of a
good
challenge.
Luck there, yeah.
But given how close-knit Newfoundland is and how positive the response from Newfoundland was to Terry's initial article about those unknown Newfoundlanders, this is part of why we wanted to put this story out there, because we thought there was a chance that somebody might know something. And in this case, we've already touched a little bit on some of the outline of Private Kirk's life. We know that he said his name was George Patrick Kirk, that he was born in St. John's, Newfoundland on St. Patrick's Day, 1894. We know that he said he was working as a miner in Stellarton in Nova Scotia, and that he enlisted quite early on in the war. He enlists in September 1914. He travels to Valcartier in Quebec to do so. And we know, as you've said, that he loses his life on the 15th of August, 1917, on the first day of the fighting at Hill 70. He's among the more than 2,200 who were killed with Canadian forces during this 10-day battle, 1,200 of whom remain missing. But with the candidates for this case, we've been looking at various men from the 13th Battalion. I've tracked down families in Scotland and in Ireland. I've tracked down families across Canada and the United States and various parts of the world, in Australia, for example. But with Private Kirk's case, it's a bit of a tricky starting point because we're not even sure that we know his correct name.
Right.
We worked with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese in St. John's. Private Kirk stated that he was Roman Catholic. The Archdiocese has been tremendously helpful. They were able to pull baptismal records for us. But there's no record of a George Patrick Kirk born at that point in time. And there was a bit of confusion as well, because while Private Kirk gives his name as George Patrick Kirk, his next of kin is his mum, Anne or Annie or Annette Quirk, which is sometimes also spelled Kirk or Quick. So there are a few different options. And there's a fair amount of competing information out there. In some instances, she's described as a widow. From the baptismal records, there's a Patrick Quirk born the following year, so a year younger than Private Kirk identified himself as being. And in that instance, that Patrick Quirk's parents were unmarried. And so there are a number of different factors happening here. It's just a reminder of how complex this work is, because we're dealing with real people.
Yeah.
And it's one of the wonderful and frustrating and fascinating things about this work, in that we're tracing people's lives. And rather than thinking about them as the thousands upon thousands who served or the 27,000 who remain missing, we're really looking at them as individuals, and we're tracing them on that individual level. But in this instance, given some of the confusion surrounding Private Kirk's background and given the level of interest in Newfoundland, we thought somebody might know someone. Somebody might know something. One of these names might be familiar.
Yeah, it is. It's just fascinating when you zoom in on, because you look at a conflict or a war and that wide range, but then you zoom in on one person, and of course they're going to have all of the family complexities of a time and a place, whether it's back it used to be called illegitimate, or it's not uncommon or wasn't uncommon in Newfoundland and Labrador for someone to be raised by who they thought was their mom and it was actually their sister, or vice versa, or whatever else, like all these interesting family dynamics. But then when you're trying to research them all these decades later, it's like, oh, yeah, that actually makes it really, really tough, right? Sean Cadigan, any thoughts just on some of that when it comes to this place in history?
Yeah, well, first I've tried to track people down by using things like baptismal records. And the most important thing about a baptismal record is to remember that it's not a record of birth.
Yeah.
And baptism can take place, it's not common, but it can take place years after birth. And so people aren't automatically baptized.
Yeah.
A lot depends on how
The Catholics used to not be a fan of waiting, though, but yeah.
No, but it can,
Yeah.
especially if there were troubled family circumstances and so on.
Oh, I like how you put that.
Right? So that can be difficult, and sometimes people just recall. I'm always struck by how many people I've met in this province, elderly people now, but people who tell me that I always used to celebrate my birthday on this day, but it turns out it might have been that day, and it's because somebody recorded something wrong, right? So record keeping is like everything else. It's prone to problems, and if your family background was apt to be a bit transient, then that could make things all the more difficult, right? So there are just so many things that can be very hard to trace about where a person lived at a particular time.
Well, and different spellings, because we did a show yesterday about the new collection of letters, or the collection of letters from the archives through Memorial University about letters to Joey Smallwood. Right. So we're talking around the time of Confederation, and like you could see the different perhaps literacy levels on folks, and we also had a conversation about some people not sending letters because they probably couldn't write, and also some of these letters you saw other people wrote them for them. So if we go to the late 19th, early 20th century. Literacy rates. So when you look at alternative spellings, not a big shocker there.
And when this story first broke, I had to confess that Quick or Quirk weren't names familiar to me. So I didn't.
No, they're not big towny
Quirk,
names, right? Yeah.
So I just checked them. I looked them up in Sari's family names.
Yeah.
And I found Quick, and it basically a very short entry saying. At Kitty Vitty and St. John's, and that's that. No Quirk.
Yeah.
So this was a new one for me.
Yeah, and I know, and so Frank, I just know through looking. One time I met up with you, and we were looking through and at my great grandfather's war records, and when I went through those afterwards, right? So he was shot in 1918. Different spellings on his name in the war records. It was like, oh, was it one L or two L's for Alan Tetford? And then like they spelled Tetford differently in a different part of it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So through just those documents, his name was spelled a few different ways while he was overseas.
Yeah. It's extremely common in the regimental records. That part of it is probably due to illiteracy. Others is just whatever officer. How we heard
whoever wrote it down,
it.
Saying it's like, sure, whatever, here we go, next.
And there have been soldiers buried with the wrong names because of it.
Yeah.
And, one recently has been changed overseas from Tibbet to Tippet.
Right.
From Little Catalina.
Yeah.
So, that's quite common.
Yeah. no wonder it makes, when you factor everything on top of like the complexities of from battlefields to family histories, Alexandra or Renee, obviously massive game changer, but like the DNA side of this, as this came online for folks, like when did, like, has this, I don't know how long your careers have been, but just like how big of a part of help has this been in recent years with the advancement of DNA and everything else?
I mean, I've been involved actively with the program since 2016, and I would say I've even noticed how much the advancements in DNA have really had an impact on the program. Some of the earliest identifications that the program made back in 2006, 2007, science was helping, certainly, but I wouldn't say it has nearly as much of a robust element to the program's identifications as it does this day. What I would emphasize, though, is that DNA is not kind of the be-all, end-all in the way that shows like CSI often make it seem, nor does it happen nearly as fast as much as we'd love it to.
I picture both of you wearing really cool sunglasses, though, through this whole thing. So
yes, I wish that was the case. No, it's a very useful tool, especially as the DNA develops more and more, and things like whole genome sequencing. It's becoming more useful, but it's not the only thing that we use. Yeah. Fundamentally, we need to make sure that the history makes sense, the anthropology makes sense, and the science supports. And all three of those pieces are what allow us to actually move forward. And so if the DNA is showing something odd, which we've had happen in the past. I mean, there are mutations in DNA. There's a large portion of the population that shares certain elements of their DNA because of how matrilineal DNA is passed down. There's quirks in DNA itself that, a sample from a tooth, for example, could show that it came from a female, whereas the rest of the jaw is indicating that individual was male. There are just oddities. Yeah. And so it's one piece of the puzzle. And I'm sure as the science continues to develop, we are always looking for the latest thing that's going to help make sure that we can do this as effectively as we can. But at the end of the day, that piece has to fit within the bigger puzzle for it to be valid and move forward as part of the case.
So speaking of quirks and DNA, or in this case possibly Kirks, just looking ahead now with the down the road for work that, like, as people come forward, what's the work for you folks now of looking down the road for trying to figure out if this 108-year-old mystery is indeed Private George Patrick Kirk?
So if we're able to, and we've already received sort of a number of tips from people who recognize some of these names, who have connections to St. John's, which is just absolutely brilliant. If we're able to trace Private Kirk's family to a viable DNA donor, and they're willing to provide us with a DNA sample, then hopefully we'll be able to process that and compare that with the DNA sample extracted from these remains. If the results come to the conclusion that there's a match there, that there's a familial link between the DNA sample provided and the remains, then that, along with all of the other evidence involved in this case, all of the historical research, all of the forensic anthropology, DNA is really one part of this process, but it's certainly not the only part. And all of this other work will be put together, and it will go forward to a review board. So the Casualty Identification Review Board, it's made up with members of both the Directorate of History and Heritage, as well as insight from a few outside partners, but that helps make an official determination whether or not we can identify these remains.
And then if it's green light for go, then what happens?
So the ultimate purpose of this work, and the goal with any of these cases, is for the dead to be buried with their name, by their regiment, and in the presence of their family. So no matter how much time has passed, and in this case we're looking at well over a century since the end of the First World War, the candidate's unit will stand in, or whatever unit perpetuates that unit as it was during the First World War. They will represent that soldier's unit. They will bury that person in the closest open Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery to where they died. So for those who've died at Hill 70, as I said, we've had a number of Hill 70 cases. They've been buried at Lewes British Cemetery near the town of Lens. And if possible, if we're able not only to identify Private Kirk, but to identify his family, then the family will also be involved in that process.
And I guess, I mean, it obviously depends on what gets turned up and everything else, but like time, like, is there if things move forward and links are made, what's the timeline of like getting the decision once everything is stacked together?
So in terms of timelines, I don't want to give a specific estimate because that
Fair enough.
guarantees something's going to spiral out of control and it will take 5 years.
Yeah.
But
I don't want to jinx you either. Yeah. So sorry.
No, of course. But the closest that the shortest time frame that we've had moving from remains being found to remains being assigned to the Casualty Identification Program, moving towards an identification, that's been 6 months. But that's when somebody was found with very specific identifiable artifacts. The longest amount of time, and certainly we're approaching this with Private Kirk's case, but the longest amount of time leading to a successful identification has been 10.5 years.
Wow.
But once an identification's been made, once a DNA match, for example, in this instance, has been established, if one is established, because of course there's so many unknown factors here, then we're able to call a review board, but it's an extended process.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. Sean, Frank, any final thoughts for today? All right. Last, we still have like a couple of minutes. The only bits, just to go back to Alexandra and Renee here. How many files do you have ongoing? Kind of like, what's the caseload like of actual working files for you folks? So, if you could talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we currently have 42 active remains cases. And that's not including those unknown Newfoundlanders who've been recovered. Those haven't officially reached the Casualty Identification Program yet. Okay. That's still sort of under the remit of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And then we have, and Renee, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, I believe we have 43 graves cases that have reached us, because that number keeps increasing every time I look at it.
Yeah, I got 13 submissions this year alone, so...
When the decision is made and everything moves forward and it's like, no, this is this person, and then you move, like things move forward with everything that comes for burial. What's it like in your office when that moment happens?
I can touch on this a little bit, Alex. I would say we usually spread the news in our office itself, and that's primarily because we work almost entirely with military personnel or reservists. There's a small clump of civilians, primarily historians, but I think in particular for those in uniform, it holds a lot of emotional weight when we're able to say that we identify. And the program is part of the heritage section, but we work very closely with our ceremonies section because they're the ones who ultimately organize the reburial or rededication ceremonies overseas. And so the moment we can come to that team and say, as part of the review board process that we have gotten a positive identification, it's just astounding to see their reaction and how they immediately want to jump in and start contacting the unit and figuring out how we get in touch with family and how we contact Commonwealth War Graves Commission to get the new headstone and organize the family to choose the epitaph and just get that ball rolling. So you can see there's always so much excitement. At the same time, there's that weight still at the end of the day, because we are still recognizing that this individual was killed, and you need to be respectful and mindful of that. But it's always fascinating to see that the first response is always joy, knowing that we've been able to solve this mystery and bring closure to everyone involved. It's this kind of double-edged sword of joy and sadness mixed together. And even at the ceremonies, from my colleagues that have been at them, they often speak to that, as the ceremony itself is very somber, and yet there's so much joy and emotion after that follows that you can just tell there's a sense of relief from family, that there's been a resolution. Yeah. But even for the individuals who we do have to inter as unknowns, there is still that sense that we are bringing them closure by burying them next to their fallen brethren in arms as well. So there's always that double-edged emotion.
Renee and Alexandra, we're out of time. Thank you so much for the hour. And Sean and Frank, thanks so much for coming in, guys. All right. Thank you. Cheers. All right, folks, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening. And, if you do have questions or thoughts for us, and if you're not sure of where to go for looking up how to get in touch with things, thesignal@cbc.ca, give us a note. Cheers.